Hey everybody, welcome to week 7. We're going to jump into cosmic myths.
Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe?
Okay, so this unit is all about where the Earth came from and where it's going. We're going to start things out as usual by giving you some new vocabulary and a lecture. And then next week we'll move into doing our own research and even doing a little bit of creative writing on the topic of cosmic myths. Let's get started. Be sure you pop out the vocab notes for Mythology Unit 4. This is Cosmic Myths, and record down the definitions for each of those vocab words, as well as notes under each of the prompts for the lecture. All right, let's start with vocabulary. We have 4 words this time: cosmos, cosmology, eschatology, and ex nihilo. Let's jump in with cosmos first. Cosmos is a term that encompasses the universe and how everything within it fits together. It comes from the Greek word order, so it really means how all of this stuff that makes up, well, everything is organized. Cosmology, then, is a word that comes from that word cosmos. It is a field of study that's concerned with the origins of the universe, how they came to be organized the way that they are. This could be explored religiously or scientifically. Eschatology is a field of study concerned with how things will end. This, too, can be explored religiously or scientifically. Ex nihilo is a concept that we'll want to get into in our first kind of cosmic myth. It means out of nothing. This refers to the Earth or the universe being formed from a void or from nothingness. Ex nihilo, out of nothing. All right, you got all those vocab words? Then let's move into our proper lecture. For this lecture, I'm going to want you to write down the cultural significance and the key features of creation, apocalypse, flood, and afterlife narratives from around the world. Let's begin with creation. Tales explaining the creation of the world or the universe are one form of cosmic myths. These stories of our origins help us to make sense of a complex universe and establish our reason for being. Humankind's purpose or role in the world is made clear in many of these stories, and through these accounts we can derive a sense of significance and value. As David Adams Leeming writes in The World of Myth, origin stories are sacramental, an outward and visible sign of an inner truth about the individual or culture in question. In other words, these stories tell us something about ourselves and who and what we are like. So what's in a creation story? Well, many of them, as I mentioned earlier, are ex nihilo, meaning spontaneous existence coming from nothing. So in these stories, we'll often begin with words like void, darkness, chaos. There will often be endless water or a being who is alone. And then, as the story progresses, some kind of a creator figure often shows up, and suddenly we start seeing matter take over where there once was void. We see light entering the darkness and order coming to the chaos. Land is brought to the water, and instead of being alone, now figures are together. Here's an example of a creation story from the Crow tribe of native North America. In the beginning, all was water, and then Old Man at the beginning looked out over the expanse of water and decided that there must be something more. And so he called on 2 ducks to help him. He asked the younger duck to dive down deep into the water, and younger duck returned with a root in its beak. The old man at the beginning knew that if there was a root, then it must be growing in something, and so it asked older duck to dive deep down into the water. And older duck was down there for a long time, but eventually came up, holding a ball of mud in its beak. Old Man at the beginning took that ball of mud and blew into it again and again until eventually it became the earth. So, that's a nice version of a creation story that has a lot of the different motifs that we see common in creation stories from around the world. Let's move on to apocalypse stories. Apocalypse stories are nearly as common as creation myths. Many Western cultures have the concept of an apocalypse or a dramatic end of the universe, while Eastern cultures tend to be more cyclical, with patterns of destruction and recreation repeating again and again. As David Adams Leeming puts it, The apocalypse of the Western world stresses the end of things and the final establishment of the kingdom of God. The Eastern view is more cyclical, placing less emphasis on human failings justly punished and more on the rhythm of the universe itself. So, an apocalypse is a translation of the word revelation, which means laid bare. It is a vision of what will be laid out in front of us. Often we'll see the opposite of a creation story. For instance, we'll begin with matter and light and order and land and togetherness, and then into these come the void and the darkness, the chaos, the endless water, and becoming alone. The one difference, though, is instead of simply ending with this dark unhappiness, there's usually an element of hope to an apocalypse story. Although we may move to void and chaos and we may lose what we once had, there's still a chance for preventing the apocalypse or returning to something better. Even if we can't do that, there's a chance of a reward or the rebirth of the planet. One example of an apocalypse story is the Norse Ragnarok. Now, in this story, we see two giant wolves devouring the sun and the moon, setting off a mighty winter. So there's that end of light and plunging into darkness. A serpent will eat away the root of the world tree that connects the 9 realms, which takes us away from order and into chaos. And with that, Loki will escape and try to bring his monstrous children to destroy the gods. Frost giants and fire giants will battle with the gods, and the giant Surt will set the world ablaze. A few people will survive to restart the world, but most of the gods will die. They will, however, get to live on in the heavenly hall of Gimli. So, there's a classic apocalypse story, and it has a lot of the elements of apocalypse stories from around the world. Okay, here goes Flood. Flood stories are often a link between creation and destruction narratives. Flood myths often signify a cleansing, a purge of the earth so that life can begin anew. The flood is a destructive force, but in the wake of the disaster, mankind is given a second chance and a fresh start. As Leeming puts it, the pattern behind the many forms that the flood myth takes is the archetype of the productive sacrifice. The flood often begins with a punishment or a consequence, but it has a path to a fresh start. So we might begin a story with the people of the world being disrespectful or having sin or greed or being a disappointment. And so a cleansing is held. It might be a cleansing of water, which is common, but also sometimes the flood is a fire or a flood of blood even. But after that cleansing is a second chance, an opportunity to do right what you had done wrong the first time. It's cleaning the slate so that you can begin anew. But I chose Tiddalik the Frog for this one. It comes from an Australian Aboriginal tale. It's a simple story, but it hits many of those flood motifs. All was dry at the beginning of this story because Tiddalik the Frog had greedily swallowed all the water. The other animals decided to make him laugh so he would open his mouth and let it out, but they could not do so until Eel came up and tickled him. This was a time that some people call the dream time, where things were a little more flexible, where reality bent a little bit. And so one small frog was able to hold all of the waters of the world, and as a result, when he let them out, it killed a lot of people and a lot of animals. But it also brought life again to those lands, and so they could begin again. So there is a classic flood narrative. Finally, the afterlife. Afterlife stories are another very common tale type. All people must face their own mortality, so naturally, cultures all over the world are concerned with what awaits us when we do. As Leeming puts it, consciousness of the total life process of life's beginning, middle, and end as a single plot is our defining characteristic. It's what makes us human, knowing that we had a beginning, we're in the middle, and there is coming an end. Afterlife myths explain perhaps the biggest unanswerable question: what happens next? Inherently, they often involve some of the same elements. Death, obviously, but then with that, reward and punishment, fear and hope, and frequently some element of being judged for one's worth during life. It becomes a more personal journey than any of the others. The afterlife is how you will end up, not how anyone else will. One classic example of the afterlife is the Egyptian land of the dead, the Dat. This is a land that is a dark underworld beyond the reach of man. It's a place of death, but also a place of becoming alive, because life and death are interconnected for the Egyptians. This is the lair of terrible demons, poisonous fire spitting serpents, lakes of fire dragons, lots of things one should be afraid of, so it's not a place that one should willingly go to if one can avoid it. One's heart will be weighed by Anubis, the jackal headed god. If it is not worthy, it would be fed to the beast, Amit. Only the worthy could navigate the river safely and ultimately reach the reward at the end of it. So, there's the Egyptian afterlife, with many of those traits that you'll see in afterlife stories from around the world. That's the basics for our lecture today. Make sure you've got your information down on that Mythology Unit 4 vocab and notes. Alright, and that's everything for Cosmic Myths for this week. Hopefully you'll be ready to jump in next week researching some cosmic myths on your own and doing a little bit of creative writing. Until next time, take care.